listeners, welcome to Grief Out Loud, a space where we talk openly about grief and the endless ways we learn to navigate it. I'm Janet Cristofaro, your host, and I'm so glad you decided to tune in today. For many of us, grief is uncharted territory, an experience we're thrown into without a map. But what if we could find guides who could help us not just find our way through the terrain, but also reshape it? Today, I'm speaking with someone who has done exactly that. Rupert Callender, the author of What Remains, Life, Death, and the Human Art of Undertaking, didn't set out to be an undertaker. But after experiencing profound grief, his father died suddenly when he was 7, and then in his 20s his mother died after an illness, Rupert found himself drawn to a radical reimagining of what funerals could be. In this episode, we talk about his journey from childhood grief to becoming a radical undertaker, the importance of giving children the opportunity to participate in end-of-life services, and how we can create more meaningful funeral and memorial rituals. It's a conversation filled with honesty, warmth, and even a little humor, as Rue invites us to rethink what it means to grieve and to honor the people in our lives who have died. Rue, thank you so much for making the time difference between the United States and England work to be part of Grief Out Loud today.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me.
So I know, we connected because of your new book, What Remains, Life, Death, and the Human Art of Undertaking. But I most want to hear about you. So I was curious if you could talk a little bit about your parents, your dad who died when you were 7 and your mom who died when you were in your 20s. How did they live?
They lived large. They lived well, actually. Yeah, my father was a retired army officer and he was 57 when I was born. Unexpected child, his only child. He'd fought in World War II, fought against the Japanese in Burma and had quite a war. And had been married for, I think, probably 25 years to his wife, and they didn't have any kids. And then very tragically, they were involved in a car accident on their way to a wedding, and she was killed. My mother was about 15 years younger than my dad, and had 2 children and had fled a fairly unpleasant marriage, and they got together, fell in love, and had me. So it was a very joyful marriage for both of them. We lived in Edinburgh. My father worked in the castle at Edinburgh Castle. They really enjoyed life, though. The 10 years or so they were married, I think, were probably the happiest, certainly of my father's life and probably my mother's life. So yeah, and it was I suppose the defining moment of my childhood when he died when I was 7. And maybe the defining moment of my young adulthood when my mum died and I was just 25 then. So I had a stepfather who remained, who was absolutely great. But it did feel a bit unfair to lose both my parents by the time I was 25. I'm astonished when I meet people in their 70s whose parents are still alive. Yeah, it was a happy childhood, though kind of neatly divided up into parts. It was happy up until the point when my father died, and then it got a bit darker after that.
I was curious, with your dad being 57 when you were born, I know he lived large. What was that like for you as a kid? Like, what kind of dad was he?
He was a very exciting, very fun-loving man. Couldn't believe his luck that he had got married and had a family. He was, I thought he was the business. I used to wait for him to return. He was retired, but he worked for the army in the castle. So I used to wait for him to return and get him to drill me with a broomstick. So I thought he was absolutely brilliant. But he was very much loved. He had lots of friends. He was always invited to kids' parties because he loved them and kids loved him. So it was, this was the 70s, so everybody was kind of smoking and drinking in the kitchen. But yeah, he was a very happy man, very happy man indeed.
And what do you recall about the day that your dad died when you were 7?
Well, it's difficult to know whether this is, because I don't think it's implanted memories. I have a kind of very strong memory of the day. I can remember my father leaving the house to go to work, and I can remember pressing my face up against the window pane to watch him out of sight. And I'm fairly sure that I ran out of the house to watch it and ran down the road to watch him go up over the hill, which is something I did quite often. And then I just kind of played idly for a couple of hours, and then there was a knock on the door, and I answered it, and there was a man in a suit, looking very solemn, who asked for my mum, and my sister, who is 17 years older than me. She kind of came to the door, and they had a conversation, and she let him in, and then she said to me and my niece, her daughter, that we're going to go for a walk. So we went out for a walk, and then we went to a sweet shop, and I remember thinking something was unusual because I was allowed 2 sweets as opposed to the kind of usual one. And then noticing on the way back, seeing the car that had brought this guy leaving, and my sister worked out that he had gone. So we went back to the home, and my sister sat me down and went, "I've got something to say. Dad's died." And I was thirsty at the time because I'd had a couple of sweets, so I kind of sat down, was very calm, went, "Okay, that's fine. Can I have some milk?" And drank some milk, and then went down to see my mum, who was in bits. That's pretty much where it stops, really. My memory, I can't. I mean, it was September that he died. It was a month after Elvis, and I remember thinking that was quite an odd juxtaposition, though they would have got on famously. That kind of is where my memories end. I don't remember that Christmas, which is only a few months away. I probably don't remember about 6 months, I think, in which time we left the flat we were in and moved to a smaller flat. Quite a lot of things happened, but that's where it just kind of stops, really. I can remember going fishing on his funeral as well. My mother's friends have said I was very angry because I'd kind of got intimations that this was happening or going to happen, and had been reassured by my mum and my dad that everything was fine. So when he did die, I think I felt a terrible grievance that I hadn't been included in the possibility of it. But I was 6 going on 7. It probably wasn't really practical to bring me in on that. But the next time I can really remember is going to my boarding school, which was about 6 months later. I went quite young anyway. Most kids of my generation were going about 8, and I was 7. But yeah, it was only 6 months after my dad had died, so it was a kind of double bereavement, really.
Yeah, that your dad dies, this person that you idolize, and then you're taken out of your home, away from your mom, all the things that are familiar, and sent to a completely different environment. One that I imagine maybe wasn't the best setup for supporting a kid who was grieving, just a guess.
I don't think there was anything in place like that at all. I'm sure that boarding schools now have changed a lot, and they have lots of support and resources, but then there was nothing. There was some quite frightening teachers most of whom, in fact, nearly all of them had seen active service in World War II, and some of them had been tortured in Japanese prisoner of war camps. So it was a curious thing to then kind of bring them back and put them in charge of young kids. And there was a rather brusque matron, which was as far as kind of pastoral care went. So no, I don't remember ever having anyone talk to me about it. Obviously, it was quite present, and I think a lot of the staff probably knew, but there wasn't any kind of, there was no kind of counselling or time out or anything really. So boarding schools in the 1970s in Britain were pretty grim, really. They were institutionalised austerity, I suppose, and certainly emotional austerity, which was kind of the point of them. I think that, this idea that boarding schools were kind of created to provide the ruling class for the empire, and so they prized a kind of certain emotional detachment. So there were no resources. I imagine not that I think a bereaved 7-year-old boy would be sent away to boarding school these days, but if they were, I think there'd be an extraordinary array of counsellors and therapists around them to kind of help them. But no, I didn't have that.
Do you have a sense, Rue, then of when did grief and grief about your dad kind of come into your consciousness? Because I'm picturing you like, my dad has died and maybe I'm angry and I don't remember and I go to boarding school and nobody talks about it. Like, when did you have a sense of like, oh, I'm a kid who's grieving?
Well, as you know, Jana, you can kind of postpone grief really, and I think when you're that little, you go into a kind of prolonged shock which lasts several years. I don't really actually think I properly started to grieve him maybe all the way until my mum died. I became aware when my mum died. She was ill for about 4.5 years, which is kind of long enough to be appalled by the initial diagnosis of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, but then kind of getting used to the remissions and treatments and a little bit of hope and all of that. So 4.5 years is quite a long time to kind of hold that in your head when you're 20 at the beginning of it. But I became aware as it got near her dying that I hadn't really properly grieved for my father, and that when my mum died, it was all going to be coming, all my chickens were going to be coming home to roost. But it's funny, I only ever had one. I've only ever had one dream about my father since he died, and it was very telling. It was I was walking down a street with my mum, and suddenly he was there, and I couldn't believe it. And he had a bit of a chat with my mum, and then kind of went shh to me, and he went, I've had to go away, and I'm on a mission. So, and that was it. That was the only dream I ever had of him. So I kind of was like, okay, I can see that I don't really properly believe that he has died on some level. I mean, I know it on an intellectual level, but deep down, there's still a lot of doubt about it. So I'm not even sure whether I've ever properly grieved him, really. But certainly not until I was well into adulthood did I properly understand that.
And then how does that contrast, or maybe not, maybe it doesn't contrast with how the grief arrived after your mother died?
Well, this again, I've been quite dysfunctional in my own personal grief, really. So I cried the last night I saw her, the night before she died. Went into the hospice to have a conversation with her, and she knew she wasn't going to die that night, but she knew she was going to die the next day, which was struck me as being quite an extraordinary thing to know when you're that near to the end of your life. And I cried on the way back from seeing her. But after that, I didn't cry. I didn't cry when she died. I went into such deep shock. Didn't cry at the funeral. Maybe a tiny tear or something like that, but really not much. And then I continued to not cry for about 7 or 8 months, and started to kind of question myself and going, well, maybe I didn't love her. We had a complicated relationship. I adored her and she adored me, but it was complicated because of being sent to boarding school, which kind of remained unresolved and untalked about. But it was enough for me to go, oh my God, maybe I didn't love her. What sort of a son am I that 8 months down the line, I've not cried. And I was in my house on my own, middle of the day, and I put on. I was happy. I was fine. I was coping with everything. I put on a music track that I particularly loved to dance to, and I was dancing merrily away, wildly dancing, and then just suddenly, it just came over me. It just broke with no warning at all. Just this wave of grief. I properly wept for about sort of 45 minutes, which is a long time to seriously weep. I wept enough that my dog got a little alarmed and just kind of went, "Oh, I can't really cope with this." So it was a relief, but I was surprised. I'm always surprised about how easy it is to pass all your grief away and think you've dealt with it, or think it's down the line. But they have a habit of returning when the next person dies. They're all there. All of your unresolved grief just kind of comes bubbling up. So I'm pretty much in step with my grief now. Luckily, I've got nobody ungrieved in my life that I should have. But it did take a long time. It probably took until my stepfather died. He outlived my mum by probably about 10 years, maybe a bit more. Got Alzheimer's, and we lost him for a couple of years before he actually died. And when he did die, I did his funeral in the church in the village where he and my mum lived. And I took the opportunity in my eulogy to kind of bury everybody in my family. So I told everybody the entire story, the complicated story of my family. My stepfather, for instance, was my uncle before he was my stepfather. He was married to my mum's sister, and my mum's sister died, and my dad died, so they got together. But it's quite, it raised some eyebrows, that. So when he died, I took the opportunity to bring in every one of my family who I'd not properly grieved for, and kind of laid them in the grave. It was a very full coffin, I'll tell you that. So yeah, I'm, as I say, I'm now up to speed with my grief.
One of the points that really stood out to me in your book was saying that your mom's funeral was the first one that you had attended, even though you'd had numerous people in your life die up until then. And then you go on to become an undertaker, or in your words, a radical undertaker. And let's hear a little about that story of how you came to be in this profession.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't the first actual funeral, but it was the first family funeral, and there had been 4 or 5 deaths in that family, in that since I've been born. So yeah, it was, my mother's funeral was the first family funeral. My mum would have been thrilled, actually, that I'd become an undertaker. She worked in the hospice in Edinburgh, Scotland's first hospice. Actually, she was the chief fundraiser, so she was very big on kind of grief and bereavement, and I think she felt quite guilty about not properly addressing mine, really. But she would be thrilled. But it was a couple of years after she died. I was lost. I had enough money to mean that I could be lost, but I was kind of getting through it quite quickly. But I was lost, and I was kind of searching for something with meaning. And I was watching television. In the book, I describe I was, I'm going to sound like a complete slacker here, but I was sitting on a sofa on a late Monday afternoon, smoking a joint, channel surfing. So I was in that kind of state of my life. And I happened upon a program. There's a journalist in Britain called Janet Street Porter, who's quite well known, a TV celebrity. And she was head of the Ramblers Association, which is a hiking and walking group. And she had a program on in which she'd go for a nice walk and meet interesting people along the way. And she met a man called Nicholas Albury. He was like 15 years older than me. He was also he was a sort of public school dropout, hippie, had been involved in some extraordinary social things in London in the 60s and 70s. And he'd had an experience where his wife had got pregnant, and they rented a horse-drawn carriage and gone off around Wales. And when it came time to have the baby, they rented a little cottage and had it in a water birth with a midwife, and it was a pain-free. Luckily, it was a brilliant birth. And then about 6 months after that, his father died of the right age, in his late 80s, in a hospital, with all of the kind of panic of trying to keep somebody alive that goes with hospitals. And Nicholas was just perplexed by this and was like, why isn't there in the same ways that the hippies had changed birth and created the natural birth movement, he was like, why isn't there a natural death movement? So he established it. And he was talking about how you didn't need, in the UK, you don't need to use an undertaker. You can do it all yourself. It's quite daunting, but you can do it all yourself. And because of that, there are no qualifications that require you to be an undertaker. So anyone can set up. So it was literally just a light bulb moment. And I went, that's it. And my whole kind of ethos arrived intact. I don't think there's anything I do today that me deciding to be an undertaker would challenge. So I went up to my local pub and I walked in and I said, "Hi, everybody, I'm going to be an undertaker." And they all laughed. But they're not laughing now, largely because I've buried at least 5 of them. So, they got it in the end. They did get it in the end. But it was 2 minutes before I saw that program. The idea of being an undertaker would have just been ridiculous. But just seeing him, hearing what he was talking about, it was absolutely extraordinary. I've never really had a revelation like it. It was marvelous, absolutely marvelous. And I had a certainty that I was going to do all these things, that I was going to be an undertaker, and that I was going to do it the way I do it.
Well, I was thinking that the term undertaker here in the States is a little antiquated. You don't hear it very often. And I was curious if it's similar in England.
Absolutely, yeah. It's not a common term. Like in America, we are known as funeral directors. Funeral with a capital F, director with a capital D. And I very much wanted to call myself an undertaker because I thought it was kind of more honest, and I thought it implied in using that word was less of the kind of authority, the kind of bestowed authority that goes when you say, "I'm the funeral director," which just kind of can make people fall into place a little and kind of go, "Okay, you're the expert. What do we do next?" And it's very, as you know, it's very easy to kind of steer people down a really quite conventional, expensive path if you have that thrall over people. So I from the beginning, I was like, no, I'm going to call myself an undertaker. The reason I like that is there's an American poet and undertaker called Thomas Lynch, and he said that the phrases of the word undertaker, because everybody always thinks it means to take you under, to bury you, but actually what it means is you undertake. It's a pledge. You go, "I'm the undertaker, and I'm undertaking to deal with the dead for the sake of the living." And I really liked that kind of simplicity of it. Yeah, I mean, sometimes I do call myself a funeral director, but very, very rarely, actually. But yeah, I like it. I think there's an honesty to the word undertaker, which just kind of, you when someone says they're an undertaker, you immediately go, okay, they do the body bit. The funeral directors might not do the body bit; they might have underlings to do it. So I just thought I'd call myself an undertaker, and it's unambiguous.
What do you remember about your first funeral burial?
It still remains probably one of the most complicated funerals I ever did. Funeral came along after I did a bit on the radio on BBC Radio Cornwall. I got a call, and I didn't really have enough equipment at that point. I'd kind of had a sort of cold room, and I had a makeshift stretcher, which was actually a thin, wide plank of oak that I got a carpenter friend of mine to kind of fashion. But I didn't have a car, so I had to get my pub landlord, who had an estate car. I had to get him to do it, and it involved going to the hospital. I'd arranged with the mortuary for them to keep the person until the day of the funeral. I arrived with the family. We went into the mortuary, into the chapel of rest, and we washed him and shaved him and dressed him. None of which I had done. I think it was, it was the first dead body I ever touched. So that was complicated in itself, having to kind of shave someone else. I've never shaved anybody else, and having to instinctively work out how to kind of dress someone with the help of his wife and his daughter, get them into the coffin, get the coffin into the back of my pub landlord's estate car, drive to a church which was absolutely packed. He was a postman, so there were all his fellow postmen were there in uniform. And then after the church service, then take him back into the car, drive him to his friend's house where we dug a grave and buried him, all in the lashing rain. So it was a multi-part day, and there were bits of it when I was so stressed I couldn't believe that I'd got myself into the situation. But by the end of it, I was just like, yeah, I can do this. I hope they get a bit easier than that, but I can do this. And I really like meeting people, ordinary people who suddenly reveal themselves to be just this extraordinary strength of character. and are incredibly honest. There's something about when somebody dies that you're in the realm of heartbreak and truth. And yeah, even that first funeral, I was just like, yeah, I really want to do this. Really want to do this.
I'm curious, Rue, with your personal experience as a child, with your dad's death, not attending his funeral. How do you counsel or talk with families who may be in that place of not knowing or feeling worried about whether or not kids should attend or not attend?
Well, that still happens a lot. I imagine that you probably are faced with that as well in your work. And it's an entirely understandable reaction. Quite often, I'll be arranging, I'll be doing the funeral for someone who's a grandfather in their late 80s. The mother will have young children, and they just kind of go, I'm not sure about bringing Thomas, and Thomas will be 7 or 8. I do say to them, I go, well, did he love his granddad? And you go, oh my God, I adored him. And did his granddad love him? Yeah, he loved him. I went, well, I didn't go to my dad's funeral, and I'm an undertaker. So just be, if you want your child to become an undertaker, you get them to swerve this this funeral. But yeah, it still happens a lot. It's getting better though. I think people now realise that children should be involved, should be at the heart of this if there's children around. Some days, sometimes I open the door, or the door's open to me, and I see the equivalent of myself, a kind of a hollow-eyed, blank-faced 7 or 8 year old who's lost their mum or their dad. It's quite heartbreaking, that, actually. I mean, I did a funeral only a couple of weeks ago for a young man who had died of a brain tumour. He'd had it for 10 years, went the first 4 years without an operation, just managed it with diet. And in that time, him and his partner had decided that despite him having this condition, they were going to have kids. So they had a boy and a girl. The girl was probably 6 and the boy was 4. And luckily the mum was very much, we're going to involve them. So they came to see his coffin on the night before. They didn't see him in it, but he looked beautiful. But they saw his coffin and understood that he was in it. And then they played an absolutely central role in the whole ceremony. The little boy had a bubble gun that he was kind of shooting everyone with as they came in. And the daughter had a beautiful flower crown. And when we carried him we did it in a village hall and then buried him in the graveyard just about 100 foot away. So when we carried him out, she walked in front with a little basket scattering rose petals. And then once he was actually buried, her and her brother completely spontaneously just kind of sat down with their legs dangling over the edge of the grave, just kind of looking, contemplating their father's coffin. It was extraordinary, having helped carry it and just be as physically involved as possible. But I think with children in these events, you need to kind of leave a pictorial record. The way I always think about it is, like me, they're not going to be visiting their grief in the next year or two, really. It's going to kind of grow in them. And they need to, when they are ready to kind of face it, they need artifacts and evidence that they were there and that they fully participated. I mean, I had a friend of mine, her dad died when she was about my age, maybe a little bit younger. And she had older siblings, only a few years older, but she had about 3 or 4 siblings. And when she was well into her 20s, they were all sitting around talking about it. And she said, oh, God, I wish I'd been at the funeral. And they were like, what do you mean? Of course you were at the funeral. You were absolutely there. But because it was the late 70s, early 80s, no one had kind of gone, let's film this kid in the moment. So when they revisit it, 20, 30 years' time, they can find their way back. I always think that it's like being in a blizzard, quite often grief. It's just, it's formless and shapeless and you're stumbling around. But if you can leave little flags that you can kind of see one flag to the next flag and make your way to it, then you can kind of pick a path through it. And I think that's what we try to do with children is make sure that when they do come to revisit it emotionally, that they have got flags to find their way back to the moment and go, oh yeah, I remember doing that. I remember what it felt like to hold the coffin. I remember what it felt like to sit on the edge of the grave, and it's simple, but so needed with kids, so needed.
Well, it makes me think about there was a part in your book when you talked about the various, platitudes that we might use to describe that someone has died, and that one of the words that you sort of held in the middle space was lost, and how, we lose a person, we lose a relationship, we sort of lose ourselves and we feel lost. And so I'm really appreciating that imagery of putting the flags to find ourselves again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, lost is but the one I really don't like is passed away, which I don't know how is that used a lot in the States.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's complete. It's used everywhere in Britain. It's on the BBC 9 o'clock news they'll talk about someone passing away, and it's as far as I can tell, it's a sort of 19th century spiritualist term, which is fine, but it's just funny that it's become this kind of blanket term for everybody. So I don't like that. I don't like loved one either, because not everybody is loved, and they still deserve a funeral. But yeah, lost is the one that I have sympathy for, because that's how it feels, and you do feel that you have lost someone, and you feel that you've lost a physical part of yourself. So yeah, lost is probably the only euphemism that really strikes home for me.
I was reflecting too that, in my role, I'm supporting folks are coming to Ducky Center for support, and it's been days, weeks, months, years since the death. And in your role as the Undertaker, you're there moment one, hour one, day one, and the immediacy of that grief. And curious how you personally try to navigate that.
Well, a lot of the time, I find the work uplifting. A lot of the time, I do. Most of the time, I find, as I say, I feel incredibly honoured to be invited into people's lives at this intimate, vulnerable moment, and gain their trust, and then create something together. So that's quite uplifting. But every so often, it does, and it's not necessarily the type of deaths, the more tragic ones. Just every so often, it starts to weigh a bit heavy on me. I think I've been through burnout a couple of times. There's also I've got a bit numb at times, which I find scarier than burnout, where you're just going, oh, I'm just not really feeling this as much as I should do. But it always comes back to me. I mean, I used to, in the early days, I was so kind of messianic about it. And I used to go dancing a lot of the all-night raves, and that I found incredibly cathartic to do. And then later on, as I'd been doing it for quite a while, I talk about it in the book, I started making crop circles in the wheat fields around the town in which I live. And then after a while, I started to realize that I could use them as a kind of ritual sinkhole into the underworld, to try and shed myself of too much grief, which sometimes it feels like it clings to you a bit. Like, we have there's wild seeds called burrs in this country, which have got needles on them, and you walk through a bush and you have to pick them all off individually. Sometimes I can feel like I'm carrying a lot of other people's grief around. So I started to develop this kind of ritual with the crop circles, in which I would make them, and I would lie down in them, and I would think of all of the kind of funerals that I had done in the previous months. I'd think of the nice ones and the happy ones, the lives well lived and all of that, and then I'd start to focus on the more tragic ones, and try to imagine, the grief was like wax on me, but it was all kind of melting and running together, and then pooling down my back, and kind of drop it into this symbolic hole into the underworld. I think trying to be creative around my own personal grief has really helped. I wrote a kind of performance ritual, which I'm still not even sure what it means or what it's about, but it's a sort of upending of the notion of being alive and being dead, and being here and being gone. It's very powerful. It's kind of it's got quite striking imagery, and it does get to people. Sometimes sometimes they're really quite chilled by it. But I think performing those has become a way for me to kind of vocalize my grief as such, really. I still am quite frightened of death. Always have been, and since my dad basically just walked out of the door and didn't come back, I was always aware of this, that life can just people can just walk out the door and that's it. I do remain quite scared of death and the manner of death, but I think really what I'd solidified a bit more into I'm very frightened of grief, and when I'm doing the funerals for comparable people of my age who have lost a husband or a wife, I find that excruciating. Really, I find that very hard. So for me, it's not difficult to be around the death. It's not challenge. It's not too challenging existentially, but to be around people's grief is really hard sometimes, and I think that's why people get avoided, because we have this kind of superstition that kind of grief is contagious, or the bad luck that if we're around someone who is in that much pain, then inevitably we will be in this pain too. But yeah, I still find grief very, very, the possibility of my own serious grief very frightening.
Which is just so human of you, which I appreciate you saying that. I think it's easy sometimes for people listening to hear me talking about grief all the time, or the guests talking about grief. You've written a book, or people have done artwork around it, and think like, oh, well, they've got it. They're not afraid of it. And like, oh no, we can still be totally terrified even if we're facing it.
Absolutely, absolutely terrified. Yeah, just seeing bereft husbands is awful. Really, it's. So yeah, I am frightened of grief, and a little bit frightened of death as well.
This year, I've officiated many weddings, but this year I officiated my first memorial service, even though I wasn't officially officiating, but I wrote and gave the eulogy for a friend's daughter who had died. And while there were some elements that felt similar, a lot of it felt different. And I was very nervous and very sweaty about it, because I felt this immense pressure, not from anyone but myself, to somehow encapsulate the totality of this person's life in 3 to 5 minutes. And so I'm curious for you, and the years that you've been doing this work, when you think about what makes a quote unquote good, and I don't really like that word, but like meaningful service for somebody at the end of their life, what are some of the things that you think about?
Um, when I started this, the whole kind of secular funeral world was just waking up, and I think there was a feeling that you had to completely replicate everything that happened in a religious church service with a kind of secular equivalent. So non-religious funerals were quite busy. There would be a lot of things going on, and too much, I think. And I realised that quite early on, of just going, actually, this kind of having a choir singing this and then someone reading that, and you've got like 12 or 13 things going on, is just is just too much, really. So we started to kind of slice back our funerals, pare them back until they were kind of almost as simple as we can get them. And I think some of the most profound funerals I've done have been with two or three people standing around a grave, and not a lot has been said. But there's just a powerful authenticity about a hole in the ground, the weight of the coffin, and the reality of the tears. So I think, but it is important to have, if you're going to be speaking about somebody has got to say it as it is, and to give a proper, full-rounded eulogy, which is very difficult if you don't know somebody. To be able to, my intention when I take a funeral service is to show the family that they have revealed something about the relationship they had with the dead person to me, but they hadn't vocalized it. That the connection between them was so strong that I can see it. And it might take a while to see that. I think one of the benefits of being the undertaker as well as the celebrant is I get so much more time with the family. So much more interactions. Most of the stuff that I need for my eulogies are throwaway remarks or just casually mentioning something that happened, not part of the big framework of their life. It's just a crucial thing. You go, oh, okay. So if they did that when they were 21, that means they're probably like this. And then taking a risk of saying it without showing it to the family, and hoping I've got it right. I think honesty and appropriateness and participation are the three watchwords that we try to use. If you've got all of those going, it'll be a great funeral.
Are you somebody who has your funeral pre-planned?
Joanna, this is the thing. I always try and talk people out of pre-planning their funerals because if you remember in the book, my mum had planned hers beautifully and thoroughly appropriately, but there was nothing for us to do, absolutely nothing. This person was going to read that, this bit of music, and she came in, it was all done. So I talk people out of organising their own funerals. I just kind of, if they come to me and go, well, I'd like a funeral plan or I'd like this, I go, well, you know what, if you really want to help your kids out, declutter your house before you die. That is the most generous thing you can do to your family. But having said that, I do have ideas about my funeral. They've changed sometimes, but I think I'm coming back to it. I mean, it's going to sound a bit hubristic, to be honest, but what I would like is I would like to be burnt on a funeral pyre. Since I'm in the realm of imagining here, let's say that it's midsummer, that I've died. I would like to be carried in my coffin up a hill in the sort of late afternoon, early evening. I'd like the fire lit as dusk falls with my coffin on it. And I'd like it to be fed with wood all night. And I'd like everyone to dance wildly around it all night. That would be, but of course, it's my family who have to make these decisions, and they might not want that. It might just be a bit too full on for them. It is. I've got someone coming in next week who wants to talk about whether when they die they want a funeral pyre. So it happens. It's a grey area legally in this country. You have to get the same paperwork that you would get for a legal cremation, so that if the police do come or you're prosecuted afterwards, you can go, well, look, I didn't murder them. Not getting rid of the evidence. Here is all the medical checks which had been done. So this was a legitimate thing. But yeah, it does happen. It does happen, and I would like that. I'd really love that. But it's dependent on a midsummer, a beautiful day, all this kind of stuff. But I'd like that.
Well, Rue, I really appreciate you. Well, the book that you wrote, What Remains, all the work you've done to sort of, what's the right word? I mean, you use the word radical undertaker, and it does feel a bit like radicalize end of life rituals for folks to open up another alternative where people have more ability to participate and to have time and space to really figure out how they want to do it and to invite everyone in who wants to be a part of it. So thank you for making that difference.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. And thank you so much for having me on. It's been great.
And listeners out there, I know you're sick of me saying it, but thank you so much for being part of our community as we head into our 10th anniversary year. 2025 is going to be 10 years of Grief Out Loud. I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at griefoutloud@dougy.org, which is dougy.org. You can also rate us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can leave a comment in Spotify. You can write a review. We just would love to hear what the show means to you. You can also head to our website, dougy.org, for all information about our local programming, our free downloadable resources like tip sheets and activity sheets, and of course, each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. Our show is a production of Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon, and we are sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.